There's a little-known part of Hollywood that most people are not aware of, known as the Audience Test Preview. The recently released book, Audienceology, reveals this for the first time. Our podcast series, Don't Kill the Messenger, brings this book to life, taking a peek behind the curtain. And now, join author and entertainment research expert, Kevin Getz.
When writing my book, Audienceology, I used one, maybe two stories from each of the people I interviewed. My guest today is quite a storyteller, and I actually used three of his stories in my book. In fact, one of those stories was about how Mel Brooks told him he would never work again in the industry because of test screening results that he once delivered. Well, ironically, Greg, who was then with MGM UA, went on to become CEO of IMAX Entertainment. He is a brilliant business strategist with unbelievable brand research and distribution knowledge, and he catapulted IMAX from being a large format exhibitor known for its dazzling documentaries to being the #1 premium movie experience in the world. Today, Greg owns and runs a successful entertainment and media consulting firm, Foster & Crew. I'm so pleased to welcome, and you're in for a great chat, my friend Greg Foster. Thanks for joining me, Greg.
Thanks, Kev. Happy to be here. That's quite an intro. Wow.
Well, it's all true.
I have goosebumps.
I could have gone on, as you know, because, first of all, I think, all right, when do we go back?
The 80s.
Yeah, late 80s.
Mid to late 80s.
Yeah. Well, I arrived in 86, 87, so that's when we met. And were you at MGM UA at that?
I was at MGM UA from June of 84 until the end of 98.
Okay, so tell us about the Mel Brooks story, which incidentally was in those early years.
Yeah. So
Spaceballs, wasn't it?
It was Spaceballs, and I'll take the moniker of being a storyteller and do the story justice. So I was working for a guy who you know very well. That was my first job out of college, out of Georgetown, Perry Katz. He ran research, and he left to run research at Universal. And about that time, there was a change in the senior management at MGM. Frankie Blondes, who was the head of MGM, was replaced by Alan Ladd Jr., known as Laddie, who I'm a brat of the business. My father was a very successful producer for many years.
Was he ever? Can I a couple of titles, please?
Sure. McCabe and Mrs. Miller, Zorro, Short Circuit, tons of Steve McQueen movies, including The Getaway, lots of them, lots of John Carpenter movies.
So we're going to get to that because you are
I'm a brat of the business.
But you're also a walking encyclopedia of some Hollywood history. So
correct.
We'll talk about that. Go back to Laddie's now in.
So Laddie is now in, and full disclosure, as a brat of the business, I grew up with his kids, one of whom is particularly a dear friend of mine today, whose name is Kellyanne, who I adore, Kellyanne Ladd. And also her sisters I knew quite well, but Kelly and I were really good friends. And so Laddie comes in, and by the way, he was very quiet, and he sees that I'm there. And he says, "Oh, good, you'll do the research now." And I'm like, "Okay." He goes, "No, you'll."
Well, what were you doing?
I was like the number 3 guy there. It was Perry, a guy named David Gross, who we both know,
yep,
and me. And I was 22 years old when I started. And when I was
out of college?
3 weeks out of Georgetown. I graduated in May, and I started there in June.
Ain't nepotism grand?
At those days it was.
It still
but
is.
by the way, I would also tell you that it's osmosis, which is the beneficiary of the company. So there's no question that I got the job because my father was in the business and was friends with Laddie. But there's also no question that my success at IMAX and also at MGM was because I learned as a young kid how to speak to filmmakers because I was around them all the time. I built my IMAX business on relationships with studios, but really with directors.
Because you knew how to talk to talent.
I know how to talk especially to directors. So
wait, this story,
except for Mel Brooks.
I was going to say, is not necessarily about talking to the director the right way.
So Laddie comes on. I become the head of research. Worked for a lovely, lovely man directly who was the head of marketing, who just passed away by the name of Greg Morrison, who was a titan. Fabulous guy, hilarious. And so Laddie's cleaning up the film slate. And it takes about a year for the older movies that he didn't green light to kind of work their way through the system. But the first movie that he greenlit was Spaceballs. Mel Brooks wrote the movie, directed the movie, starred in the movie, put it together. It was his production company. And it's the first movie that Laddie greenlit at MGM UA. And the movie's made, and it's been cut. Mel's had his 10 weeks Directors Guild cut, and we're going to have our first research screening to see what people think about the film. And they both, because they work together so closely, Laddie and Mel Brooks, at Fox, when Laddie ran Fox and greenlit and championed Mel with Young Frankenstein, The Elephant Man, which is Mel Brooks produced, didn't direct or star in.
Because that was hysterical.
But it's hysterical. Yeah, not really. It was a gorgeous movie. If you haven't seen it, it's an absolutely stunning movie.
Wasn't it in black and white?
Yes, it was.
Yeah.
It also was. So Young Frankenstein's, Blazing Saddles, Silent Movie, all of the classic Mel Brooks comedies were mostly made under Laddie's watch and Jay Cantor's watch.
Hertzberg.
And Mike Hertzberg, that's right. So Michael Hertzberg, wow.
Call out to Mike because he's my buddy at the tennis club.
So what happened was we had this screening at their Good Luck Charm, which was a theater in San Francisco. I can't remember the name, but I want to say the North Point. So it's my first time being in charge of a movie on the research side. So I'm shaking in my pants, or something else that starts with an S. And I go to meet Mel Brooks, who I've known my whole life because he's friends with my dad, but he hasn't seen me in probably 10 years and does not make any connection. So I give him my recommendation for the audience that we should bring in, how we should describe the movie, what the card should be.
A couple weeks before the screening.
Right, and he makes a little notes, but I'm his buddy. Way to go, kid. Way to go, kid. That's perfect.
And NRG conducted the research?
No. The research was not conducted by NRG. The research was conducted by Lieberman Research. Correct.
Got it.
Because Laddie didn't use NRG. That was not his research company of choice. So we go to San Francisco. I go the night before, spend that night, because it was film at that point. It's not digital. The movie's plattered. We do a run through.
Okay, hold on. For those of you of a certain age, movies used to be what we call unmarried prints, which meant that the sound and the picture existed on two separate tracks, and that's how we did pre-screenings in those days.
And they had to be sunk up.
Exactly. So you'd often have breaks because it was pretty fragile. They were working with
celluloid.
Truly, and that was not an uncommon thing that happened. Go ahead, sorry.
So we have a test of it to make sure that it works. It works. It goes until probably 1 or 2 in the morning. This is during the week, by the way, not weekdays, weeknights, not on the weekend. And next day, kind of getting excited. Because it was the first movie under this new regime, everybody from LA flew up for the screening. There must have been 50 people, executives, maybe even a board member or two. It was a big deal. And I'm there like 3 hours before the movie starts. The crowd that we had invited and had been pre-screened for meeting all the criteria starts coming in. Mel is there, initially very, very happy, tells me to sit next to him, which I do, and I thought that was a nice honor. And he's psyched. He's nervous energy, but he's excited. His wife was there, may she rest in peace, Anne Bancroft. And Laddie's like feeling really good, and the screening starts. And for the first half an hour, 40 minutes, it's a full bedlam amount of laughing.
Oh,
it never stopped. Great. It was just
right out of the gate.
Right out of the gate.
And then
at a certain point, it stopped, and it didn't stop gradually. It just stopped.
Oh Lord!
And I would say by 50 minutes into it, there started to be some walkouts. There was a couple in front of us who obviously spoke English, but also spoke, I believe it was Mandarin, and started speaking to each other quite frequently in Mandarin in front of Mel Brooks, who was not happy at all. And so he, at a certain point, like an hour and 15 minutes into the screening, which was probably close to 2 hours, he got up and kind of, walked out and was pissed. There's no other way of putting it. He didn't expect it. And he did what a lot of people would do, is he shot the messenger.
Yeah, I was just going to ask you the name of my podcast,
He
buddy.
shot the messenger.
Don't kill the messenger.
So movie's over, and we all walk out. And remember, I didn't say this. I'm under probation because I'm so young for this job.
He gave you, what, 3 months?
And I think it was more like 6 months.
Okay.
And
Laddie told you that.
Yep. When he said, I got to do this, though, because this is the first time you've had a leadership position and you are very young, I have to formally put you under probation. I said, okay. So at the end of the screening, we count the cards.
Yep.
Mel said he did
breaking them into different
breaking them into the 5 categories, right?
And under and over.
Excellent, very good, average, fair, poor.
Right.
We didn't do excellent, very good, good, fair, poor, because that was not symmetrical. We wanted to have it 2 positive, descending, neutral, and 2 negative, descending. So we get to the time at the auditorium where I tell them what the kind of top 2 boxes were, the word of mouth. It wasn't horrible, but it wasn't great, and he expected it to be great. So ironically, we had a dinner reservation at a Chinese restaurant in San Francisco, a place called Tommy Toes, I think is what it was called. It was famous and was really, really good. And I am literally shitting in my pants because I wanted to have this job permanently. I really enjoyed it. I'm a stats guy. That's part of what I studied at Georgetown. That's why I do kind of well in fantasy baseball, and it's finance related. I like numbers. So
you come in with the numbers.
So I stayed as far away from Mel Brooks as I possibly can.
So far, so good.
And I sat at the 3rd or 4th table because there were a lot of people and didn't eat a thing. And the night's over and everyone gets up and I'm kind of, shaking in my boots a little bit. And I go up to Mel Brooks very respectfully and I say, Mr. Brooks, or I probably called him Mel, I am going to go back to the hotel and read the comments on the cards. What time would you like me to call you in the morning? And he said to me, young man, listen to me very carefully. Don't call me tomorrow. Don't ever call me. And best of luck with your career. And as he said that, I was like embarrassed, scared, all of that. Laddie hears it, walks over, takes the 2 of us aside. He's affectionate, Laddie, but he wasn't demonstratively affectionate. Puts his kind of arm around both of us. He's in the middle. And he says, Greg, how long have I known you? And I said, probably my whole life. Mel kind of looks at him like, that was weird. What do you mean your whole life? And he goes, Mel, how long have I known you? And Mel goes, I don't know, Laddie, 30 years, something like that. He said, so you both have to trust me. Mel, Greg's good at his work. I've been through a lot of this other people's movies with him in the last year. This is the first one that's mine. He's going to go back to the hotel and read the cards. And when he's finished reading the cards, he'd like to call you. What time would you like him to call you tomorrow? And Mel said, okay, 10 o'clock in the morning. And Laddie said, Greg, will you please read the cards and call Mel first, even before you call me at 10 o'clock in the morning? I said, I absolutely will. And I said, Mr. Brooks, I promise I will be honest and constructive and helpful because that's what I'm here to do. And Laddie then said, and by the way, I've told this story so many times where I've actually had tears. I don't think I'm going to today, but it was about the nicest thing business-wise anyone's ever done for me. He said to me in front of Mel Brooks and with everyone listening, and you're no longer on probation. You've earned this job. And that was the story. And I went on to work with Mel.
What was he like the next morning, Mel?
He went from a 10 of anger to kind of a 5. And I wouldn't say it was anger. It was more, I have a lot of work left to do. And what ended up happening is the movie just had pacing issues. It was too much of a good thing. Spaceballs
got to know when to leave the party with those movies.
Spaceballs is still revered. It's probably, in the old DVD Blu-ray days, it was probably so, in that day it was probably Betamax too. It's out of theater life, kind of made it a classic in a way. And it was more than fine.
I had a dinner the other night with David Zucker, and we were talking about Naked Guns, and they're remaking it now at Paramount. They have a very particular cadence. I want to move back in time a little bit to your dad, to your brother, Gary, who I've worked with a number of times, also a marvelous producer. And you have another brother as well.
Yep.
What was it like growing up? Where did you grow up?
Actually, so we grew up in Beverly Hills.
Flats of
Beverly Hills. We were not going to, in any way, again, I don't want to apologize. There's nothing I'm apologizing for.
Who were some of your
We
classmates?
grew up extremely privileged in Beverly Hills. which was like Mayberry RFD when we were kids.
Absolutely. No gates on the houses.
It was
you could walk right up to Lucille Ball's house and Jack Benny's house.
All the time.
Right?
And we'd see them all the time, and they'd all say hello, and everyone was nice.
What street were you on?
I was on Palm Drive, and which is sort of halfway between Doheny and the Beverly Hills Hotel. So 5 blocks one way or the other. And it was a fabulous place to grow up. Nothing's perfect, but it was pretty good. So my dad was a producer, and the deal was if my dad made a movie that was out of town and he was gone for more than 3 weeks, we all went.
Mom didn't work outside the house, correct?
Actually, she did. She did a lot of charity work, and she also was very much my dad's social companion as my dad was trying to become a producer. He was a publicist before.
Oh, he was.
And he had a great publicity company. That's he represented Steve McQueen. He represented Jack Benny.
I just remember this big
Jack
guy
Lord,
who was bald.
Yep, he was just like his son. So Steve McQueen said, you should be a producer, and he became a producer. The first movie he made was McCabe and Mrs. Miller, which is a fantastic movie. It's on the U.S. Film Registry is one of the finest films ever made. And so he started making those movies, feature movies that he produced, late 60s, early 70s.
Do you remember Steve McQueen coming over?
I mean,
and
Steve McQueen
Neil?
was very much a part of...
I'm friendly with Neil now.
A part of... Well, if you mention me to Neil, she'll laugh.
She's wonderful. Wonderful ingenue from musical theater. Yeah.
And my parents and my brothers. And I think a really scary story, which is very much discussed in Bob Evans's book, The Kid Stays in the Picture, was that Bob was the husband of Ally McGraw, and my dad was producing Steve's movie, The Getaway, with Steve McQueen and Ally McGraw.
Absolutely.
And they had a very passionate affair, and Bob Evans, who was at the time running Paramount, realized that something was going on and flew down to El Paso, Texas, where the movie was being shot. We were all there. He flew in the Gulf Western jet. My dad picked him up at the airport, and my dad would not let him go to the hotel. And it's all in Bob Evans' documentary and book. And my dad walked Bob Evans for the whole night around El Paso, Texas, would not let him into the hotel. And he said at the end, he said, so you're not going to let me see her, right? And my dad said, yes, I'm not. It won't be good for any of us. And Bob Evans left, and they did get divorced, and Steve McQueen and Ally McGraw did get married. I think it was a volatile marriage because pretty much everything with Steve McQueen was volatile. But they were married for a while and had a nice run. And at a certain point, my dad, after The Getaway was a pretty big hit, started submitting new scripts to the town. And the first script that he submitted to Paramount, to Bob Evans, there's no email at the time, obviously. This is 73, 74, was returned to my dad, returned to sender. And until Bob Evans stopped being the head of Paramount Pictures,
he couldn't make another picture there.
My dad was persona non grata.
Wow.
He was not allowed on the lot.
Now, I remember your dad being extremely fair and kind. What did he teach?
He was also tough.
Now, but to me, he was always very nice and respectful. And I mean, I was a pisher working in the business, and he was always, I thought, elegant and kind.
First of all, my dad was very smart. He was the first person in his family to
he had 3 sons.
graduate
so
from college.
You and I are the same age. You probably saw.
I'm sure that's part of it. But I think he also, my dad, he always included and coveted the next generation. He was really afraid of growing old. And in fact, as soon as my dad realized in his 70s, late 70s, maybe even early 80s, because the last movie my dad produced was The Fog, the second The Fog. He was probably in his early 80s at that point. And as soon as he realized that he wasn't making any more movies, his health immediately declined. He identified himself for his work. Doesn't mean he wasn't a good dad. Doesn't mean he wasn't a good husband. He wasn't perfect. But we knew we were loved.
What did you learn from him? I'm talking about from the business.
So the thing I learned the most, no question about it, was how to talk to filmmakers, how to talk to editors, how to talk to directors, how to talk to producers. A little bit less about how to talk to writers, but very, very much how to talk to directors.
You also, I remember from my book, you talking about how Laddie always told you to start with the positive.
Correct.
Which I've learned early on as well.
Well, that was from the Mel Brooks thing.
I know. I didn't want to.
That was from because Mel Brooks.
Yeah.
The first thing I said about the cards is our numbers are just below average. That was the first thing I said.
Turned off immediately.
And he was immediately gone. That's correct. And I did learn that start with the positive, and especially if you can have 2 or 3 positives until you say, but there is still some work to be done.
Yeah, listeners, it's important to know this because when you start with the positive, and there's always something positive to find in a picture, always, and you embellish on that a little bit, what you want to do is really find the superpower of what this movie is and lean into that a little bit and then say, that said, the numbers are soft. So how can we get them up? That's the real question here. And I know you and I have shared in so many
lots of stories
over the years. So I completely respect what you're saying.
So I should have started with that. I was 22, 23 years old. I learned. Oh, actually, I was 23 then. The other thing.
By the way, why did Bob Evans get pissed at your dad for doing what was right for the movie?
Who knows?
And he used it against him.
It doesn't matter.
They
both had great careers. So the other thing that's really important, I think, is that my dad taught me was also the importance, and I try and make this, I still do it, of knowing people's names, knowing assistants' names, husbands' names, wives' names, kids' names, etc. And I think that's really, really important. That was extremely important to me as I was building IMAX. We went from like 30 people, probably 40 people when I first started at IMAX Entertainment because, as Kevin said, we had never made a Hollywood movie before. We had one that came out that we were kind of involved with, but that's a longer story that I didn't work there at the time, called Fantasia 2000. Right. But in terms of real Hollywood movies, not redos, we had never done one.
What was
before.
The first one that
did?
Changed that paradigm?
The first one that we ever did was Apollo 13, 7 years after the re-release of the original Apollo 13. But it was critical. It was critical because
Ron Howard's picture.
Correct. Ron Howard's movie starring Tom Hanks and Gary Sinise and a whole bunch of people, directed by Ron Howard, produced by Brian Grazer and Ron. So it was also incredibly important because Richard Lovett, who runs CAA and has always been a big supporter of me and a friend, was the one who got us in to see Brian and Ron and Tom. And that relationship between IMAX and that company and those people became an anchor tenant of my first 10 years at IMAX. And the other reason why it was so good is because it was what we did. Space, right? We made movies about whales, bears, seals, and space as documentaries that played in museums, science centers, or aquariums. So to get a movie like Apollo 13, which was so stunning, and we tested it. We took about 20 minutes of the movie at Ron Howard's request, and we put it through this proprietary process that we have called, that I still say we, even though I work for 7 other companies as a consultant, but IMAX will always be a we for me. And I love that they've let me still be a we for them.
Call out to
That's Rich. That's totally Rich.
Rich Gelfand.
Completely Rich, who's I've never been closer to. He's never been as supportive of me as he is now.
Real visionary.
So we tested about 15 or 20 minutes, and the part we tested was the takeoff of Apollo 13. And what was so brilliant about it is this technology that we had.
What was it called? Do you remember?
It's called DMR.
DMR.
Yes. And we have a 4th, 5th, 6th version of it.
Of course you do.
We always had thought that the big, long master shots where you see everything were going to be the most gorgeous. A vista in the Grand Canyon, the shot from space. But what we realized is the intimacy that it provided of a extreme close-up on the actress Kathleen Quinlan playing Mrs. Lovell as you see the tears come down her face.
Knowing that she may never see her husband
Knowing
again.
that she may never see him again. Took everyone's breath away. In New York City at the Lincoln Square IMAX Theater, which is a massive screen.
Wow.
Ron was there. I think Tom Hanks was there.
It elevated the emotional experience.
I know Brian Grazer was there.
Michael Rosenberg, probably.
Michael Rosenberg was a huge champion and still is of IMAX and of me. He's such a good guy, Michael Rosenberg.
He's a dear friend.
He's the best. I love that guy.
I wish I could persuade him to come on this podcast.
Oh, he'd be great. But he's too discreet. So what happened was we all basically started tearing up. And I called Rich and said,
It couldn't have gone better.
It could not have gone better. And Rich was based in New York. He just wasn't there because it was just for a small group.
Sure.
By the way, a guy named Hugh Murray, who I worked with at IMAX for a long time, was there and was kind of running point on the technology. And also a guy named Lorne Orleans, who worked very closely with Hugh.
That's a great name.
So shout out to them, both two guys from Canada. Actually, one's from Scotland and one's from Montreal, but they live in Toronto. And it was amazing. So it was all set up by Richard Lovett. And then, a month later, there was this crazy press conference.
But it was Universal you had to convince.
It was Universal.
Right?
Mark Schmugger was the guy who bought into it hook, line, and sinker.
Of course he did, because he gets it.
Could not have been more supportive. And so that was the first one. And it didn't make a lot of money. It was released in 20 locations, most of which were still museum science centers and aquariums.
But it was the beginning of a new
chapter. And we actually got huge pushback from certain exhibitors, cinema owners, who didn't have IMAX and had no interest in IMAX coming into the business when we would be because in those days you had what was called clearance, meaning that if you were a theater that got all their movies from the studios, a new theater couldn't be built within a certain zone. But what happened was when we would go to a museum that had an IMAX theater and was half a block or 5 blocks away from a, quote, proper movie theater, a commercial movie theater, the owners of the commercial movie theaters were not happy. Now, obviously, we know now they are the ones that have all the IMAX theaters.
Absolutely.
Because it created incremental business by saying, if you really want to see a movie, this is the way to do it. But it was started on Apollo 13.
And I'd like to explore that. When we come back, we're going to talk about how Christopher Nolan really helped evolve the brand and how you got him. We'll be back in a moment.
Get a glimpse into a secret part of Hollywood that few are aware of and that filmmakers rarely talk about. In the new book, Audienceology by Kevin Getz. Each chapter is filled with never-before-revealed inside stories and interviews from famous studio chiefs, directors, producers, and movie stars, bringing the art and science of audienceology into focus. Audienceology, how moviegoers shape the films we love. From Tiller Press at Simon & Schuster. Available now.
We're back with Greg Foster talking about IMAX. And Greg, I wanted to get into Christopher Nolan and how he became such a supporter and really became a passionate advocate of the brand. And that really did help evolve IMAX. Can you tell us about it?
Yeah, I can. And, again, credit where credit is due. I wish I could say that it was something that, was my idea. It wasn't. When Warner Brothers came to me about Batman Begins in 2002, I would say, they said, we're making Batman Begins with a young filmmaker named Christopher Nolan. He's done Memento. I had not seen it.
Oh, I worked on it. It was really pretty amazing.
I had not seen the movie at the time. Have seen it many times since, and it still baffles me, but it's incredible.
But that nonlinear structure was so cool.
And that became Chris's thing. I love it. Usually you catch up to it right around the beginning of the third act, when what you saw in the beginning comes full circle, and then you take it. So really the people that were responsible for that were, Chris obviously has a long history of affection for IMAX. He grew up mostly in Chicago. He went to the Chicago Museum of the Science Institute, whatever it's called, I can't remember. Growing up, is as technical a person as you can possibly be, while at the same time having this incredible ability to tell a story and to evoke emotion in the story. He went to Warner Brothers and said, I want to do this movie with IMAX.
What did that mean at that point?
At that point, it just meant...
Did you have your own cameras then?
No, we did, but he never used the cameras for that movie. The first movie he used the cameras for was the next movie he made in IMAX, which is this little movie called The Dark Knight. But Batman Begins, we did the test, as usual. The people who really, really made the difference in making it happen, besides obviously the great team at IMAX, led by Rich, Brad Wexler was there too, but I think at that point Rich had really become the head of the kind of the movie part of things. And the Warner Brothers guys were just incredible.
So who was running distribution then? Was it Dan?
Yes, Dan Fellman was running distribution at the time. And I actually think it's worth saying. Dan took advantage in a good way, not in a bad way, in a very, very good way of IMAX, making the distribution area have an exposure to filmmakers that it never really had before. Very few of the grosses, the box office, there was no computer box office at that time. What the distribution guys did is they would get a bag of grosses at their door, like a newspaper, at 6 o'clock in the morning.
From EDI.
Yeah, on Saturday and Sunday and Monday.
This is before Rentrack and then before ComScore. Which
and, a lot of them lived in Simi Valley or
Agora Hills,
and played golf a lot. And Dan Fellman wanted to be much more involved in the process. And I think he gets a lot of credit for the distribution group at all studios having a much deeper relationship with directors and producers, but particularly directors. So anyway, Dan was a big supporter, as was his number two, my buddy and actually my brother, Jeff Goldstein. It all started really with Alan Horn, who chose to support us from the very, very beginning when he was running Warner Brothers, and then when he went to be in charge of running the studio at Walt Disney Studios. But it really, Warner Brothers, there would be no IMAX as it is today if it weren't for Warner Brothers. From Mark Solomon in post-production to Steve Papazian, who was physical production, to Steve Spira, who was the head business affairs person, to my dear friend Don Taubin, who at the time ran marketing.
It was they all bought into it.
Suzanne Fritz, who was in publicity and was really young at the time and very much involved in Chris and Emma. She was their person for a long, long time at Warner Brothers. And it was really incredible. On the outside, the two people who really supported us from day one and continue to support IMAX, and also are dear, dear friends of mine. One is Dan Aloni, Chris's agent, and the other is Michael Shankman, Chris's longtime lawyer. And they bought into IMAX from day one, too. So I would say Batman Begins, maybe with the exception of Polar Express, were the two most important early movies that IMAX had.
And how much of the box office would you say, was it up to that 12% of the total U.S. box office?
It probably was close to it, but the difference is we didn't have nearly as many theaters because it was all film-based. But the film-based per-screen average, meaning the 70 millimeter, 15 perforations per frame on a 70 millimeter frame of film, as opposed to traditional 70 millimeter, which is really 5 perforations on a 70 millimeter frame. So
and regular film is 24.
So
right?
But it's not 70 millimeter, it's 35.
Yeah, exactly.
So you get so much more image. So Chris came over and Emma and we talked and it was an easy decision.
IMAX doesn't own brick and mortar, by the way. IMAX owns the cameras, the equipment, and the in-theater equipment to project. But also, is it both picture and sound?
Yes. We only do IMAX sound. They only do IMAX sound. I keep saying we, but like I said, that's never going to stop. And I'm proud that it's never going to stop. So it just was a whole new
and then suddenly everyone wanted it.
World for us, but there was more to it. So I think that two other people who also get a huge amount of credit for the Chris Nolan relationship are David and Patricia Keeley, who have worked at IMAX longer than anyone. They're still at IMAX. David and Patricia used to run post-production. They've kind of evolved now into being technical ambassadors and relationship ambassadors, but they have a fabulous relationship with Chris and Emma, and they deserve to, because first of all, it's interesting that Chris and Emma are husband and wife and work together, and David and Patricia are husband and wife and work together, and they kind of all speak the same language. They take their filmmaking incredibly seriously. Their focus on detail is amazing. And that's the part, I think, with Chris more than anything else that I will say. Chris's attention to detail made us as a company and continues to make IMAX so much better, because there is literally nothing that you can get by him. So if there's anything that's not right, I promise you, you don't have to point it out to him.
From a QC standpoint.
He will point it out to you. It's probably better that you do point it out, because if you don't, he'll think you're trying to hide something. But he is a perfectionist.
And you've been loyal in return, because if he needs screens, he gets the screens. How do you manage all of those movies who want to be on IMAX, particularly pre-COVID?
Right.
And now that we're coming back into a theatrical cadence, how does IMAX juggle everyone's relationship?
You know what? It's a combination of quantitative and qualitative. Part of it is absolutely relationship-based. I think we saw that a couple of years ago with Mission Impossible and Maverick, which was kind of ironic and difficult because Tom Cruise is an incredible supporter of IMAX as well. But it's very, very difficult to do, and it's especially difficult to do now that IMAX is doing 40, 50, 60, 70 movies a year globally. Where it became easier was when the network exploded, when IMAX developed a digital and then a laser projector. Because you can have more than one movie playing at a time, because it wasn't these giant platters of film that you had to put on the giant IMAX projection system or use with the IMAX projection system.
And every one of the IMAX theaters is now equipped with that?
Every commercial one is.
Yes.
And some of them, I think there's still 30 to 35 that you can also throw it in the film-based systems, which Chris likes to do, and which end up generating 4 times the box office of non-film-based IMAX prints.
Is there a saturation point, you think, with IMAX?
I don't think it's there yet. There's a saturation point with everything.
I only say that because what's so brilliant about IMAX was the in-theater experience is experiential.
Right.
And what IMAX did so cleverly was to capitalize on that and understand consumer behavior. And consumer behavior was about, I want to see huge pictures and I want to hear great sound.
Right.
And those are the most key 2 elements that will get people to leave their homes.
Right.
So I would think that there's even a lot more opportunity for IMAX.
There is more opportunity, and the one thing IMAX doesn't do is put an IMAX theater across the street from another IMAX theater or put 2 or 3 IMAX screens in one complex. They work very, very hard to
create the special nature
correct.
of it.
The supply-demand issue is extremely important. If you limit supply, your demand will go up. I wouldn't say IMAX limits the supply. They just don't flog it.
Well, let's face it. During COVID, I'm sure that scared the crap out of them because everything just closed.
Yeah, but IMAX was one of the few companies, because it's asset light and they don't own the real estate. They don't pay the rent.
Right.
So, of course, it hurt. It hurt everyone. But I think it probably
hurt them less than
and I
others,
think IMAX at the end of the day, and I say this to everyone, and again, I haven't worked there in 5 years, is the big winner in the theatrical business. I don't think there's any question at all that IMAX is the one that will ultimately ride this out until the very end.
There's no question.
And you're seeing, and Rich is doing such a good job of running it, and he hired a great head of marketing in Ann Globe, and Craig Demmel does a great job in marketing and distribution. The Keeleys are still there. It's just a very good brand with an excellent piece of technology that has become known as the kind of gold leaf of, the Tiffany, if you will, of moviegoing. And people will leave their house and pay a little bit more to have an experience that you can't replicate anywhere else.
And that's really where theatrical is going. How do you create an experience? Greg, tell us about your consulting firm. The name of it is?
The name of it is Foster & Crew. I'm not going to talk about my clients because it's about them. But I have a very, very...
7 clients right now, right?
I have 7 clients right now, and many of them are brand names.
What do you do? What makes you so good at what you do? Like, what do you provide? Are each one of them a different service?
Each one's a little bit different. I kind of do 3 or 4 things. I connect people, and I enjoy doing that. So if someone from Japan wants to meet someone from Korea, I can make that connection. I can also connect in town here. I am an expert, if you will, in the sort of distribution strategy world, and some people use me for that. International is always very, very important to me, and my old buddies from IMAX always emphasized that selling does not stop on the West Coast and the East Coast of North America. And the reality is that 60 to 70% of the box office comes from international. And we were very underpenetrated in the international market. And we focused on the US until we went digital. And once we went digital, we just exploded in the international market, and it has served the company extremely well. So I help international clients with their content and ideas outside of their territory. And I help US North American clients with their help, with their business outside of the United States. And
so that's one of the things you do.
I connect people. I help them with their distribution strategy. There's a company that I work for who makes a lot of really terrific movies, but is not a distributor. And so I help them with many other people decide what makes the most sense. I don't work for IMAX, but I often am promoting a partnership with IMAX with my clients because I think it's very, very important. Like I said, it's not only because I worked there, it's because I really, truly believe in IMAX. I also am very focused on kind of overall industry issues, on what's happening in the business, on some of the scary things that are happening that I might have an early sense of, just because I don't have to deal with the minutia any longer.
Because you typically work with the C-suite. You don't work in the tactical.
I do not.
Always in the strategy.
That's correct.
Yeah. What's your superpower?
My superpower, I think, that's a really good question. I would say at the end of the day, my superpower is melding my relationship skills with my strategy. And I put all of that kind of mostly into my ability to connect with filmmakers. And if I connect with a filmmaker, that gives me a much better opportunity with the company that I work for. And it also gives me an opportunity to potentially help the director get what they want. Because in my opinion, while the studios are very busy paying for all these movies, there's 15 or 20 directors that matter more than they can pick any movie they want.
You're a mensch, and that's, I think, is one of your superpowers, if not your primary one. I mean, people depend on you because they genuinely like you. You're trustworthy. Your word is your bond. I have literally known you now, I'll choke up a little bit, for so long, and you've been such a devoted and loyal friend beyond the business. Not that you and I pal around that much together, although we sometimes socialize. We sometimes do, but I'm saying I would feel like not even a bit hesitant to call you if I had any kind of business problem or even a personal problem. And I so appreciate that about you.
Well, thank you. The last client that I signed with, and it's probably the last one I'm going to because I am maxed out right now.
Listen, high-class problem, right?
Kind of emphasize this, and I will say who they are because I don't think they'll have a problem with it. And if they do, I'll call you and ask you to cut it out. It's with a guy named Michael O'Leary, who is the head of the National Association of Theater Owners. And the reason I decided to do it, partially is because I really like Michael. And secondly, I'm a movie guy. I'm a theater guy. I'm a cinema guy. That's what I am. That is my focus. It's what I grew up with. It's what, when my kids were young, it wasn't a question of what we were going to do on a Friday or Saturday night. We knew we were going to all go to a movie. I wish that were the case with young families now. It doesn't seem to be quite the same. But I'm a movie guy, and the theatrical experience is something that I personally love. I think it's a massive part of global culture. Many of the clients that I work for internationally not only make movies, but also own movie theater networks. And that's not a coincidence. By the way, they're also often IMAX clients. So that's why.
You don't have your head in the clouds. You also know that streaming is, in fact, here to stay. You know it's a practical and very important part of the culture. Can you speak of how you work with some of your streaming clients versus a theatrical, and how you grapple with that?
Well, on the client side, none of my clients are only streaming. And I don't really work on streaming for my clients. I work on the theatrical side. I'm not an expert at it, and I'm not knocking it. I just don't want to be. I'm a cinema guy. But there's no question that things are changing. I'm the last person who will say that I saw it coming to the extent that it did. I think COVID exacerbated it.
It did. It didn't create it, but it exacerbated it.
But I think it had already started.
Absolutely.
And I think what we've learned nevertheless, is that when you have a movie that's worth the theatrical experience, regardless of the size of it, if it demonstrates somehow, some way, people will enjoy this best in a movie theater, it's going to come out in a movie theater, and it will play for as long as it plays, and then it will eventually do even better.
Yeah.
When it's on the streaming.
Do you remember when I showed you that study pre-COVID?
Mm-hmm.
I mean, that was telling about why, particularly Gen Zs, were not going to the theaters as much because of the being digital natives. And it actually came to bear a lot sooner, as you said, than any of us had anticipated. Are you hopeful for the future for theatrical moviegoing?
I am. I do think that the kind of 1-2 gut punch of coming out of the COVID world and struggling for a bit, and then having what happened last summer, culminating with Barbenheimer, and for the strikes to have then gone on for another 4 or 5 months, just was
devastating.
So devastating and so hard to take as someone who truly loves and lives the business. So I think we'll get through this year, but I think 2025, with the films being as big as they are, is the year where we're really going to start to see some tremendous growth in the box office, because anyone who studies the slate, 2025 is off the charts.
Yeah.
And you can't find a space for a movie any longer. I know I've had to go through that a lot with some clients of mine in the last 2 or 3 months.
But this year's going to be a bit of a bloodbath.
Yeah,
we may not even get to $8 billion. Is that fair?
I think the strike has had
100%. At first, the pandemic recovery, and then the strike.
With that said, it's always good to look ahead.
Absolutely. And you and I are both optimists.
And I think 2025 is a year that will make people who love going to the movies very, very happy. Again, I'm doing this now from a technical point of view. When you can't find a date to release a movie, and you certainly can't find a date in 2025 to release a movie in IMAX, that's a good sign.
Greg Foster, we could talk forever, but I have to let you go because you have to get across town to one of your 7 clients. Thank you so much for being here and for sharing your wisdom and some of your stories.
My pleasure. Was just as fun for me as it was for you, and you're the best.
Thank you. To our listeners, I hope you enjoyed our interview with Greg Foster. For more filmmaking and audience testing stories, I invite you to check out my book, Audienceology, at Amazon or through my website at kevingets360.com. You can also follow me on my social media at kevingets360. Next time on Don't Kill the Messenger, I will welcome the dynamic director and producer, Mick G. Until then, I'm Kevin Getz, and to you, our listeners, I appreciate you being part of the movie-making process. Your opinions matter.